In 1847, in the hills of eastern Kentucky, a family disappeared from all records. Not because they died, not because they moved, but because something happened that made the government decide you should never know their names. By 1920, 3 generations were living under one roof, and according to every witness who saw them, none of them had aged a single day. The children who were 10 in 1847 were still 10 in 1920. The parents who were 30 looked 37 years later. When scientists tried to investigate, they were turned away at gunpoint by federal marshals. When a university team tried to publish findings, their research was seized and destroyed. The family still exists today, hidden behind layers of legal protection you and I will never penetrate. And what I'm about to tell you is compiled from pension records, land deeds, church documents, and the testimony of those who broke their silence before they died. This isn't folklore. This is suppressed American history. And once you understand why they hid this family, you'll understand why they hide everything else. The family's name has been scrubbed from official records, but local historians in Appalachia still whisper it in private conversations, away from recording devices and government ears. They were originally French Huguenots who fled religious persecution in the 1600s, settling in the remote hollows of Kentucky where the state barely had jurisdiction and the federal government didn't care to look. They were known as healers, herbalists, and mystics, people who understood the land and the old ways that predated Christian conquest of Europe. By the time Kentucky became a state, this family had been thriving in isolation for generations, passing down knowledge that was already ancient when Rome fell. They didn't seek attention. They didn't cause trouble. They lived quietly, farmed their land, and kept to themselves. But in 1847, something changed. A traveling minister came through the area and stayed with the family for 3 weeks. When he left, he wrote a letter to a bishop in Louisville that would set off a chain of events lasting over a century. The minister's letter described what he called a disruption in the order of time itself. He claimed the family possessed a spring on their property that produced water unlike anything documented in natural science. Those who drank from it regularly, he said, seemed to step outside the normal flow of aging. He watched a woman in her 60s move with the strength of someone in their 20s. He saw children with an unsettling wisdom in their eyes, as if they had lived far longer than their bodies suggested. He wrote that the father of the family told him the spring had been there long before European settlement, that the Cherokee who lived in the region before removal had considered it sacred and forbidden, a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. The minister begged the bishop to send scholars, doctors, anyone who could study this phenomenon and determine if it was divine intervention or something far darker. The bishop forwarded the letter to colleagues in the medical field. Within 2 months, the first expedition was organized. The expedition never reached the family. According to travel logs recovered a century later, the group of 5 doctors and naturalists made it within 10 miles of the property before being intercepted by men who identified themselves as federal agents, though no federal agency at the time would have had jurisdiction or interest in a remote Kentucky hollow. The agents confiscated all documentation of the trip, including journals, maps, and correspondence. They told the doctors that the area was under quarantine due to an unspecified contagious disease and that any attempt to enter would result in arrest or worse. One doctor protested, saying he had received no notification of any quarantine from state or federal health authorities. The agent's response, recorded in a personal diary that surfaced in an estate sale in 1978, was chilling. There are things the public cannot know because the public cannot handle what it would mean. The expedition returned to Louisville, their reputations quietly destroyed through whisper campaigns and professional sabotage. None of them ever spoke publicly about what they were prevented from investigating. For the next 30 years, the family lived in complete isolation, cut off from the outside world by forces that claimed to be protecting public health but offered no evidence of disease, no documentation of illness, nothing that would justify the quarantine. Local residents who attempted to visit the property reported being turned back by armed guards who wore no insignia and answered to no local authority. The family's land, which had been modest but productive, was gradually surrounded by parcels purchased by anonymous buyers through shell companies based in Washington and New York. By 1880, the family was living on an island of their own property, encircled by land owned by entities that existed only on paper. Census records from this period show no mention of the family, as if they had been erased from the American population. Tax records disappeared. Church records were removed from local archives. Even the gravestones of earlier family members were dug up and relocated to an unknown location. This wasn't neglect. This was systematic erasure, the kind that requires resources, planning, and authority that operates above the law. In 1891, a photographer named Samuel Corrigan managed to get close enough to the property to take a series of images before being chased off by guards. Corrigan was a veteran of the Civil War, a man who had seen horrors that would break most people, and he said the family's property had an atmosphere that unsettled him in ways combat never did. The photographs he took were confiscated when he returned to town, but he had hidden the glass plate negatives in a false bottom of his camera case. Those images were discovered by his great-granddaughter in 2003 and briefly appeared on a genealogy website before being removed under legal threat. I've seen descriptions of those photographs from people who viewed them before they vanished. They showed a family standing in front of a cabin, 3 generations together, and according to every witness, the physical appearance of each person was identical to descriptions from the 1847 minister's letter. 44 years had passed. No one in the family looked a day older. Corrigan wrote in his journal that the family didn't smile in the photograph. They stared at the camera with what he described as the eyes of people who have seen too much time. By the turn of the 20th century, the family had become a ghost story, a legend that locals told but didn't quite believe. But the federal presence around their property never diminished. In fact, it intensified. During the First World War, when the government was drafting millions of young men to fight in Europe, census workers attempted to conduct a count of the family's property. They were blocked by military personnel who claimed the area was being used for classified defense research. No research facility was ever built there. No military operations were ever documented. But the guards remained, rotating in shifts, maintaining a perimeter that kept everyone out and presumably kept the family in. In 1923, a journalist from the Lexington Herald tried to investigate after hearing stories from local miners who worked in the surrounding hills. The journalist's name was Rebecca Thorne, and she was one of the few women in Kentucky journalism at the time, known for her relentless pursuit of corruption and cover-ups. She disappeared 3 days after filing a report with her editor about the family. Her body was never found. Rebecca Thorne's disappearance was ruled a voluntary departure by authorities who claimed she had expressed interest in moving west to pursue other opportunities. Her family protested, saying she had been receiving threats and that her notes had been ransacked the night before she vanished. The editor who received her last report said it contained detailed interviews with locals who claimed to have interacted with family members in secret, people who said the family was desperate to leave but were being held against their will by forces they couldn't identify or escape. Thorne's report also mentioned the spring, describing it as a source of water that emerges from deep limestone caverns, water that locals claim has properties beyond anything science can explain, water that powerful interests have decided must remain hidden from public knowledge at any cost. Her report was never published. The newspaper's offices were broken into a week later, and all of Thorne's files on the family were stolen. The break-in was never solved. And the message was clear. Anyone who investigated this family would face consequences that went beyond journalism, beyond law, into the realm of power that doesn't need to justify itself. During the Great Depression, the federal government's grip on the property tightened even further. Under the guise of New Deal land conservation programs, additional parcels around the family were seized through eminent domain and transferred to agencies that had no clear conservation mission. The family's isolation became absolute. But something else happened during this period that reveals how deep the cover-up went. In 1934, a team from Johns Hopkins University received a grant to study longevity in isolated populations, specifically targeting communities in Appalachia. The grant was funded by a foundation with ties to the Carnegie and Rockefeller families, organizations that had long been interested in eugenics, population control, and the biological mechanisms of aging. The Hopkins team was given access to remote communities throughout Kentucky, except for one. When they inquired about the family whose property was surrounded by federal guards, they were told the area was off-limits due to ongoing security concerns. The lead researcher, a physician named Dr. Elliot Marsh, pushed for access. He was removed from the study within a month and his medical license was suspended on fabricated ethics charges. Dr. Marsh didn't stay quiet. In a series of letters to colleagues that were discovered in a university archive in 1998, he described his brief investigation into the family as the closest I have ever come to discovering something that would rewrite our understanding of human biology, and the most terrifying example of institutional power-crushing scientific inquiry I have ever witnessed. He wrote that during his short time researching the case, he was followed, his mail was opened, his phone was tapped, and he received anonymous warnings to abandon the investigation. He also wrote that he had spoken with a former guard who had worked the perimeter of the family's property in the 1920s. The guard, dying of cancer and no longer afraid of reprisal, told Marsh that the family was being kept in what amounted to a prison, that they were subjects of observation, and that samples of the spring water were regularly taken by men in suits who arrived in black cars with government plates. The guard said he once saw a child from the family try to run, and the child was brought back at gunpoint. Marsh concluded his letters by saying the family wasn't being protected. They were being held. As we passed through the decades into the mid-20th century, the technology of surveillance and control improved, and so did the methods used to keep the family hidden. During the Cold War, when the government was experimenting with everything from mind control to biological weapons, the family's property was reclassified under national security protocols that made it legally invisible. The land didn't appear on county maps. It wasn't included in property tax rolls. If you tried to look up the deed, you'd find nothing. The family had been erased from the legal existence of the United States. But they were still there. And people who lived in the surrounding hills still saw them occasionally, usually at night, moving through the woods near the property line, always watched, always followed by men who kept them in sight. One witness, a logger who worked the area in the 1950s, said he saw a woman from the family who matched descriptions from the 1800s. She looked at him with eyes that he described as filled with a sadness that went deeper than any human emotion I've ever seen, like she was grieving for something that had been lost long before I was born. In 1962, during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the government's attention was focused on the threat of nuclear war, a group of local activists attempted to force the issue into the public. They organized a protest at the county courthouse, demanding answers about why a family of American citizens was being held on their own property, why federal agents were maintaining an armed perimeter, and why no one in any position of authority would acknowledge that anything unusual was happening. The protest was small, maybe 30 people. Mostly older residents who remembered the stories and younger people who were inspired by the civil rights movement's challenge to unjust authority. The protest lasted 3 hours before state police arrived and dispersed the crowd. The organizers were arrested on charges of trespassing and disturbing the peace, charges that made no sense given they were protesting on public property. The local newspaper covered the story on page 6 in a 4-sentence blurb that mentioned nothing about the family, nothing about the decades of secrecy, nothing about the real reason for the protest. It was as if the event had been pre-sanitized before it even happened. But one of the protesters, a coal miner named Thomas Ridley, didn't let it go. Ridley had grown up hearing his grandfather's stories about the family, stories that painted them not as dangerous or diseased but as prisoners of forces that wanted to control something they possessed. Ridley spent the next 15 years collecting testimony from anyone who would talk, building a file of evidence that he planned to bring to a senator or congressman who might actually care about justice. He conducted interviews with former guards, none of whom would go on record but all of whom confirmed the same basic facts. The family was real, they hadn't aged in ways that made sense. The spring on their property was the focus of intense interest from government scientists, and the entire operation was classified at a level above top secret. Ridley also obtained documents through a contact in the Land Records Office, documents that showed the web of shell companies and federal agencies that had surrounded the family's property. He had built a case that could blow the story open. In 1977, Thomas Ridley died in a car accident on a clear day on a straight road that he had driven thousands of times. His files were never recovered. The pattern is unmistakable. Every time someone gets close to exposing the truth, they are stopped, silenced, or destroyed. This isn't coincidence. This is a system protecting itself, a power structure that has decided this family and whatever they represent must remain hidden, not because they're dangerous to the public but because they're dangerous to the narrative. Think about what it would mean if the world knew that aging could be stopped or dramatically slowed through natural means, through something as simple as water from a spring that's been on this continent longer than our civilization. Think about what that would do to the pharmaceutical industry, to the medical establishment, to the entire economic system built on managing decline and selling temporary solutions to permanent problems. Think about what it would do to the idea that we need their institutions, their experts, their control. The family in Kentucky represents a truth that the powers that be cannot allow, that nature holds answers they don't control, that human potential exceeds their projections, and that we don't need them as much as they need us to believe we do. By the 1980s, the original members of the family from the 1800s would have been over 130 years old, and yet reports continued to surface of people matching their descriptions. A hiker who got lost in the woods near the property in 1983 claimed he encountered a man who helped him find his way back to the trail. The hiker said the man spoke with an accent he couldn't place, used phrases that sounded old-fashioned, and moved through the forest with a familiarity that suggested he had been there for a very, very long time. When the hiker tried to thank him and ask his name, The man simply said, "We're not supposed to be seen," and disappeared into the trees. The hiker reported the encounter to local authorities, thinking maybe the man was a hermit or someone in distress. He was visited 2 days later by men who identified themselves as Forest Service officers, though their badges didn't match any federal agency the hiker recognized. They told him he had encountered a protected research subject and that discussing the encounter with anyone could result in federal charges. The hiker never spoke about it again publicly, but he told the story to his family, and it eventually made its way into local folklore. In the 90s, as the internet began to connect people who had been isolated in their knowledge, scattered reports about the family started appearing on early conspiracy forums and message boards. These posts were quickly deleted, not by moderators but by forces that could reach into platforms and remove content without explanation. Users who posted about the family reported their accounts being suspended, their IP addresses being tracked, and in some cases, visits from individuals who warned them to stop discussing topics that were under national security protection. This was before the surveillance state became openly acknowledged, before we all accepted that our digital lives were being monitored and controlled. But even in the early days of online communication, the family was a forbidden topic, a subject that triggered responses from entities that most people didn't even know existed. A few determined researchers managed to compile fragments of information, piecing together a timeline that matched what I've told you, but every attempt to publish or distribute this information was shut down. The message was clear. This story would not be allowed to spread. I want you to pause and think about what's required to maintain this level of secrecy for over 150 years. This isn't just a cover-up. This is a sustained, multi-generational operation involving federal agencies, private contractors, legal manipulation, surveillance, intimidation, and violence. This requires resources, manpower, and institutional commitment that goes beyond any single administration or political party. This is the permanent state in action, the deep machinery of power that operates regardless of who's in office, regardless of what the public believes or wants. And it's all focused on one family in Kentucky who had the misfortune of possessing something that threatened the control system. They couldn't be bought. They couldn't be convinced to leave. So they were imprisoned on their own land, turned into subjects of study, and erased from history. And you were never supposed to know about it. None of us were. Because if we knew, we might start asking what else they're hiding, what other truths have been suppressed, what other possibilities have been kept from us so that we stay dependent, compliant, and contained. In the early 2000s, a research assistant at the National Archives discovered a series of memos from the 1920s that referenced the Kentucky anomaly and discussed protocols for containment and study. The memos were heavily redacted, but what remained was revealing. They discussed the need to prevent public panic and disruptive social implications if information about the family became widespread. They referenced ongoing biological sampling and analysis conducted by a group referred to only as the Committee, which appears to have been a collaboration between government agencies and private interests. The memos also confirmed that the family was being held involuntarily and that legal justifications for their detention were fabricated and maintained through classified executive orders that were never subject to congressional oversight or judicial review. The research assistant attempted to publish these findings through academic channels. Her paper was rejected by every journal she submitted to, not because it lacked evidence, but because reviewers said the implications were too sensitive for public discourse. She eventually posted the paper on her personal website. It was online for 6 hours before the site was taken down and her hosting account was permanently suspended. Comment this phrase if you're ready to see what they don't want you to see, if you're ready to step outside the comfortable lies and face the reality of control. I see the cage. Write it now and write it again. Because that's what this is. The family in Kentucky isn't the anomaly. The cage is the anomaly. The system that decides what you're allowed to know, what questions you're allowed to ask, what possibilities you're allowed to imagine. That's the real horror. The family is just one example, one piece of evidence that the world you've been told is real is actually a carefully managed illusion, a prison built from information control, institutional gatekeeping, and the systematic suppression of anything that threatens their power. And the reason I'm telling you this story isn't to entertain you or scare you. It's to show you that the cage exists, that it's been there your whole life, and that most people never even see the bars because they've been taught not to look. But you're looking now. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So comment "I see the cage" twice, lock it in, and let's keep going deeper. The family's story entered a new phase in 2008 when satellite imaging technology became sophisticated enough that civilian researchers could access detailed topographical data of remote areas. A team of geography students working on a land use project noticed an anomaly in eastern Kentucky, a parcel of land that appeared on satellite images but had no corresponding property records, no listed owners, and no official designation. The land was surrounded by what appeared to be a security fence, and the images showed structures that didn't match any known residential or commercial patterns. The students brought their findings to their professor, who recognized immediately that they had stumbled onto something that could end careers. He advised them to drop the project and choose a different area to study. Two of the students ignored his advice and continued investigating. They cross-referenced the location with historical maps, census data, and geological surveys. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. This was the family's property, and it was still being actively secured. The students presented their findings at a regional conference. They were approached afterward by men who offered them jobs with a private security firm at salaries far beyond what geography graduates typically earn. Both students accepted and signed non-disclosure agreements. Their research was never published. In 2012, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a journalist seeking information about land management in Kentucky accidentally triggered the release of a single document that should never have been declassified. The document was a 1947 memo from the Army Corps of Engineers discussing the need to reinforce containment infrastructure around Site 7 in eastern Kentucky. The memo referenced biological assets of national importance and recommended maintaining indefinite operational security due to strategic implications for defense and medical research. The document was online on the government's FOIA portal for less than 24 hours before it was removed and reclassified. But in that window, it was downloaded by dozens of researchers and conspiracy theorists who recognized its significance. This was the first official government document that acknowledged, however indirectly, that something unusual was being contained in Kentucky, that it had biological importance, and that it was considered a matter of national security. The document spread through underground networks and was analyzed extensively. Every analyst reached the same conclusion. The family was real, the cover-up was real, and it extended to the highest levels of government. But mainstream media never touched the story. It was too far outside acceptable discourse, too threatening to institutional credibility. Let me tell you what I think is really happening, the conclusion that makes sense when you look at all the evidence, all the patterns, all the ways the story has been suppressed for over a century and a half. The family in Kentucky possesses something that fundamentally challenges the power structure's control over life, death, and human potential. Whether it's the spring water, their genetics, their knowledge, or some combination of all three doesn't matter as much as what it represents. Proof that the limits we're told are natural are actually artificial, that the decline we're told is inevitable is actually manageable, and that the dependency we're conditioned to accept is actually unnecessary. The powers that be built their empire on managing your decline, selling you solutions to problems they created, and convincing you that you need their systems to survive. The family threatens that entire structure. So they can't kill them, whatever makes the family unique might die with them. They can't release them, they might share their knowledge. And they can't acknowledge them, because then everyone would know that the cage was always optional, that the bars were always an illusion, and that the key was always in reach. This is the pattern of control that runs through every suppressed truth in American history. When something threatens the established order, it's not refuted or debunked through honest debate and evidence. It's buried, hidden, classified, and erased. The people who try to expose it are discredited, intimidated, or eliminated. The evidence is seized, destroyed, or locked away in archives that the public will never access. And the story is relegated to conspiracy theory, a label that was weaponized precisely to prevent people from investigating claims that might actually be true. The family in Kentucky is just one example, but it's a perfect example because it shows how far the system will go to maintain control. This isn't about protecting the public. It's about protecting power. It's about making sure that you stay dependent on their medicine, their food, their information, their institutions. Because the moment you realize you don't need them, the moment you understand that human potential exceeds their projections and that nature provides solutions they can't patent or profit from, their entire system collapses. And they know it. That's why the family has been hidden for 150 years. That's why you were never supposed to hear this story. And that's why they'll do everything they can to make sure it stays hidden. In 2015, a documentary filmmaker began researching the family's story after hearing about it through contacts in the Appalachian oral history community. He spent 2 years collecting interviews, tracking down descendants of witnesses, and attempting to locate the property through land records and satellite imagery. He managed to piece together more information than anyone had publicly compiled, including testimony from people who claimed to be distant relatives of the family, people who said their ancestors had maintained secret contact with the imprisoned family members for generations. The filmmaker was building toward a release that could finally bring the story to a mainstream audience. In 2017, his production company's offices were broken into and all of his footage, notes, and hard drives were stolen. Nothing else was taken. No money, no equipment, just the material related to the Kentucky family. The filmmaker reported the theft to local police, who investigated briefly and closed the case as unsolved. He attempted to recreate his work from memory and secondary sources, but funding dried up, his distribution contacts stopped returning calls, and eventually he abandoned the project. He gave one interview a year later where he said, "There are stories in this country that you're simply not allowed to tell, and the cost of trying is higher than most people are willing to pay. I need you to understand something crucial. This story isn't ancient history. This is happening now. The family or their descendants are still out there, still hidden, still contained by forces that operate outside democratic oversight, outside legal accountability, outside any framework that the average American would recognize as legitimate government. This is the shadow state in action, the machinery of control that persists regardless of elections, regardless of public opinion, regardless of constitutional protections. And the family is just one example of what they're hiding. Think about how many stories like this exist, how many suppressed truths are locked away in classified vaults, how much knowledge has been kept from humanity because it threatened the wrong people's power. We live in a world where information is controlled as tightly as any physical resource, where the boundaries of acceptable knowledge are policed as strictly as any border, and where curiosity itself becomes dangerous when it points toward truths that the system can't allow. The family in Kentucky is a symbol of all of this, a reminder that the reality you've been taught is negotiable, that history is written by those who win the information war, and that your understanding of what's possible has been deliberately limited. By 2018, the story had become fragmented across dozens of conspiracy websites, truth-seeking forums, and underground research communities. No single source had all the information, and the deliberate spread of disinformation had muddied the waters to the point where separating fact from fiction required extensive research and critical thinking. This is intentional. One of the most effective ways to suppress truth is not to hide it completely but to bury it in so much noise that people give up trying to find it. Release contradictory accounts. Flood the zone with fake documents. Create obvious hoaxes that discredit legitimate research. Make it so exhausting to separate truth from lies that most people just dismiss the entire topic as crazy conspiracy nonsense. This is exactly what happened with the Kentucky family. By 2020, if you searched online for information about them, you'd find hundreds of contradictory claims, obvious fabrications, and deliberately misleading accounts. The real evidence, the historical documents, the eyewitness testimony, the paper trail of suppression, was buried under layers of garbage designed to make serious researchers look foolish for even investigating. This is psychological warfare applied to information control, and it works because most people don't have the time or resources to dig through the noise. But here's what they can't control: the pattern. Even when the details are obscured, even when the evidence is hidden, the pattern of suppression itself tells you that something real is being hidden. When a story is consistently suppressed across decades, when researchers are consistently intimidated or silenced, when documents are consistently classified or destroyed, when the institutional response is consistent denial and misdirection, that pattern is evidence. You don't need perfect proof to recognize that you're being lied to. You just need to see the shape of the lie, the way power moves to protect itself, the methods it uses to keep you from asking questions. The Kentucky family's story shows the pattern perfectly. Every attempt to investigate was blocked. Every attempt to publish was prevented. Every researcher faced consequences. That pattern doesn't happen by accident. It happens because something true and threatening is being protected from public knowledge. And once you recognize the pattern in one story, you start seeing it everywhere. Because this isn't the only truth they're hiding. It's just one of the most dramatic examples of how far they'll go to keep you in the dark. Let's talk about the spring itself, because this is where the story gets to the heart of what's being suppressed. According to the testimony that survived, the spring emerges from limestone caves that go deep into the earth, possibly connecting to underground water systems that have been isolated from surface water for thousands or millions of years. The water has a unique mineral composition, but more than that, witnesses described it as having properties that can't be explained by chemistry alone. People who drank it regularly reported not just slower aging but enhanced vitality, faster healing, and a quality of awareness that's difficult to describe but consistent across accounts. The family told early visitors that the spring had been known to indigenous peoples for centuries before European settlement, that it was considered sacred and dangerous, and that drinking from it created obligations and changes that not everyone was prepared to accept. The scientific establishment has never been allowed to study it properly because the government seized control of the site before any legitimate research could be conducted. Everything we know comes from fragments, from witnesses who broke silence, from people who saw and remembered before they were silenced. And what they describe is a natural phenomenon that would revolutionize our understanding of human biology, health, and aging if it were allowed to be studied openly. But it won't be studied openly, because open study would mean loss of control. The pharmaceutical industry generates hundreds of billions of dollars selling treatments for aging-related conditions. The medical establishment built its authority on managing decline. The insurance industry prices its products based on actuarial tables that assume certain rates of aging and death. The entire economic system depends on controlled human obsolescence, on bodies that break down on predictable schedules, on people who become dependent on expensive interventions as they age. A natural source of life extension or age reversal would destroy all of that. It would shift power away from institutions and back to individuals. It would prove that nature provides solutions that corporate medicine can't replicate or control. And most dangerous of all, it would show people that they've been lied to about fundamental aspects of human potential, that the limits they've accepted as natural are actually artificial constraints imposed to maintain control. The spring in Kentucky represents everything the control system fears: autonomous power, natural solutions, and knowledge that can't be commodified or controlled. That's why it's hidden. That's why the family is imprisoned. That's why you were never supposed to hear this story. In 2020, during the chaos of the pandemic, when government surveillance and control reached new levels of intensity, a rumor began circulating in underground research networks that the family's property had been designated as a biocontainment site and that new security measures had been implemented. The rumor claimed that under cover of pandemic emergency powers, additional research facilities had been constructed on the property and that the family members were being subjected to more intensive study. None of this could be verified because the property remains completely inaccessible to outside observers, but the timing is significant. Throughout history, crises have been used as cover for expanding control over things that were already being controlled. The pandemic gave governments around the world unprecedented power to restrict movement, mandate medical interventions, and suppress information deemed dangerous to public health. If you wanted to intensify research on a family that shouldn't officially exist while investigating a phenomenon that challenges every assumption about human biology, a global health emergency would be the perfect cover. I can't prove this is what happened, but the pattern suggests it, and the pattern has been reliable for over 150 years. When power expands, it expands everywhere, including in places the public never sees. Here's what I want you to take from this story: you live in a system that believes it owns you. It believes it has the right to decide what you can know, what questions you can ask, what possibilities you can imagine. It believes it has the right to suppress anything that threatens its control, even if that means imprisoning families for generations, destroying researchers' careers, and lying to entire populations about fundamental aspects of reality. The Kentucky family isn't suffering this treatment because they're dangerous. They're suffering it because they're proof that the system's power is illegitimate, that its control is based on artificial scarcity and managed ignorance, and that human beings have potential that far exceeds what we've been told is possible. Every suppressed truth follows this same pattern. Every hidden technology, every buried discovery, every erased piece of history, they're all hidden for the same reason. Because truth is power, and the people who control the flow of information are terrified of what happens when that power is distributed instead of concentrated. The family in Kentucky has been trapped in this system for over a century and a half, paying the price for possessing something that should belong to all of humanity. And you might be wondering why I'm telling you this story, why I'm willing to expose myself to the risks that every other researcher has faced. The answer is simple: because the system's power depends on silence, on isolation, on making sure that people who know the truth never connect with each other, never build movements, never create alternative structures of knowledge and power. But we're living in an era where information can't be completely controlled anymore, where networks exist outside institutional oversight, where people are hungry for truth and increasingly unwilling to accept comfortable lies. The old methods of suppression still work on individuals, but they're breaking down when applied to distributed networks. So I'm telling you this story, and I'm asking you to share it, to investigate it, to become part of a community that refuses to accept the boundaries of allowed knowledge. Because every person who understands what's being hidden from them, who sees the pattern of control and refuses to unsee it, who shares forbidden knowledge and builds networks of truth, that's a crack in the system, a weakness in the cage, a point of vulnerability in the machinery of power that has kept humanity contained for far too long. Let's go deeper into what this means for you personally. Because this isn't just about a family in Kentucky or a spring with unusual properties. This is about the architecture of control that shapes your entire life. Think about everything you've been taught about health, about aging, about what's possible for human beings. Think about how much of that information comes from institutions that profit from your decline, from your dependence, from your belief that you need their interventions to survive. Think about how aggressively alternative approaches to health are suppressed, how natural remedies are dismissed as quackery while pharmaceutical solutions are mandated, how anyone who questions the official narrative is labeled as dangerous or crazy. The Kentucky family is the ultimate example of this pattern, but the pattern itself is everywhere. It's in the food you eat, the medicine you take, the information you consume, the beliefs you hold about what your body and mind can do. You've been conditioned to accept limits that benefit the system, not you. You've been taught to outsource your health, your thinking, your potential to authorities who claim expertise but have never demonstrated genuine concern for your well-being. And the worst part is that this conditioning is so deep, so pervasive, so reinforced by every institution you encounter, that most people never even question it. But questioning it is exactly what the Kentucky family forces you to do. If aging can be dramatically slowed or stopped through natural means, what else have they lied about? If the government is willing to imprison families for generations to hide this knowledge, what else are they hiding? If institutional science refuses to investigate phenomena that threaten profitable industries, what discoveries have been suppressed? These questions don't have comfortable answers, and that's the point. Comfort is the enemy of truth. The system keeps you comfortable enough that you don't ask dangerous questions, that you don't investigate forbidden topics, that you accept the boundaries of allowed knowledge without pushing against them. The Kentucky family's imprisonment is a warning. This is what happens when you possess truth that threatens power. But it's also an invitation. If they're willing to go this far to hide it, imagine how much power that truth contains. Imagine what you could do with knowledge that the control system fears so deeply that it will maintain a multi-generational cover-up to suppress it. That's the real promise here. Not just the specific knowledge about the family or the spring, but the understanding that forbidden knowledge exists, that it's being actively suppressed, and that finding it and sharing it is an act of resistance against the system that wants to keep you controlled. In the last few years, something has shifted in how people relate to institutional authority. Trust in government, media, medicine, and science has collapsed to historic lows. More people than ever before are willing to question official narratives, to investigate alternative explanations, to build communities around shared skepticism of power. This shift didn't happen because people became stupid or irrational. It happened because the institutions proved themselves to be liars, over and over again, until even their most loyal defenders couldn't deny the pattern. And stories like the Kentucky family are part of why this shift is happening. Because when you realize that governments are willing to imprison families for generations to hide knowledge, when you understand that institutions will destroy careers and lives to maintain control over information, when you see that the boundaries of allowed knowledge are arbitrary and self-serving, you can't go back to trusting those institutions. You can't unsee the cage once you've seen it. You can't pretend the system has your best interests at heart when you understand how much effort it puts into keeping you ignorant. And this is terrifying to the people in power because their entire system depends on your willing compliance, on your belief that they're legitimate, on your acceptance of their authority. When that belief collapses, their power collapses with it. So what do you do with this knowledge? How do you operate in a world where you understand that fundamental truths are being hidden, that institutions are actively working against your best interests, that the reality you were taught is a carefully managed illusion? First, you stop outsourcing your thinking to authorities who have proven they don't deserve your trust. You develop your own capacity for critical analysis, for pattern recognition, for separating truth from propaganda. You build networks with other people who are asking dangerous questions and sharing forbidden knowledge. You invest in skills and resources that make you less dependent on systems you can't trust. You learn about health, about history, about the mechanisms of control, about all the things they don't want you to understand. And most importantly, you share what you learn. You become a node in a network of truth that exists outside institutional control. You help other people see the cage. Because that's how the system falls. Not through violent revolution, not through political movements that can be co-opted, but through mass awakening, through enough people understanding how they've been lied to that the lies stop working. The Kentucky family can't be freed by individual action. But the control system that imprisons them can be undermined by collective refusal to accept their authority, their narratives, their carefully managed version of reality. Let me give you the most disturbing part of this entire story, the detail that should make you question everything else you think you know about how this country operates. In all the documentation that's survived, in all the testimony from witnesses and researchers, In all the fragments of truth that have leaked out over 150 years, there's never been any legal justification provided for holding the family. No charges, no court orders, no official documentation that would explain under what authority American citizens are being detained indefinitely on their own property. The family hasn't been convicted of crimes. They haven't been declared public health threats through any legitimate process. They haven't been given hearings or trials or any opportunity to challenge their detention. They've simply been imprisoned without due process, without legal recourse by forces that operate above the law. And this has been going on since before the Civil War, through every expansion of civil rights, through every reform movement, through every period when we told ourselves that America was becoming more free and more just. The family's imprisonment continued, uninterrupted, because the power that holds them isn't subject to law. It is the law when it wants to be, and it's above the law when that's more convenient. This is what sovereignty actually looks like when you strip away the comfortable myths. Real power doesn't ask permission. It doesn't justify itself. It simply acts, and consequences happen to anyone who challenges it. This is the truth that sits at the heart of every suppressed story, every covered-up crime, every hidden piece of history. The system you live under is not constrained by the rules it claims to follow. The Constitution, the laws, the institutions of democratic accountability, they apply when it's convenient for power to pretend they matter, and they're ignored when power decides that its interests are more important. The Kentucky family has lived this reality for generations. And you live in the same system. The only difference is that you haven't personally encountered the moment where power decides that the rules don't apply to you, that your rights are negotiable, that your freedom depends entirely on whether maintaining it serves the system's purposes. Most people never reach that point. They live and die within the boundaries of allowed existence, never pushing hard enough against the cage to discover how strong the bars really are. But the family pushed against it, or maybe they didn't even push. Maybe they just existed with something that threatened power, and that was enough. And now they're still there, still hidden, still imprisoned, still being studied like laboratory subjects, while the rest of us pretend that we live in a country where such things don't happen, where citizens have rights that can't be violated, where truth eventually comes out and justice eventually prevails. The family's ongoing imprisonment is proof that these are comfortable lies we tell ourselves to avoid facing how powerless we really are against organized institutional force. But here's the thing about power, it's not magic. It's not invincible. It's a system of control that depends on specific conditions being maintained. People have to believe in its legitimacy, they have to be isolated enough that they can't organize effective resistance, they have to be ignorant of alternatives, and they have to be more afraid of the consequences of resistance than of the consequences of compliance. When any of these conditions break down, power becomes vulnerable. And right now, all of them are breaking down simultaneously. People don't believe institutions are legitimate anymore. Digital networks have ended isolation. Information about alternatives is spreading faster than it can be suppressed. And more people are becoming more afraid of what happens if they stay compliant than of what happens if they resist. The Kentucky family represents the old model of control: hide the truth, imprison anyone who threatens it, maintain the lie through force. But that model is failing. Not because power has become less ruthless, but because the conditions that made that ruthlessness effective are disappearing. You're proof of that. You're here, listening to this story, learning about things you were never supposed to know, becoming part of a network of awareness that exists outside institutional control. That's what they fear most. Not individuals who know the truth, but networks of people who share it, who build on it, who use it to create alternatives to the systems that have kept humanity contained. So let me leave you with this. The family in Kentucky is still out there. Still hidden. Still contained. Still subjects of study by forces that have no legal right to hold them but all the practical power to keep them imprisoned. Their story is one of the most dramatic examples of institutional control in American history, but it's not unique. It's just the one that most clearly shows how far the system will go to suppress truth that threatens its power. And the reason I've told you this story in such detail, with such weight, isn't to make you feel helpless. It's to show you that the cage is real, that it's been there all along, and that seeing it clearly is the first step to finding your way out. The family can't free themselves. But you can free yourself from the lies you've been told about what's real, what's possible, and what you're allowed to know. Share this story. Investigate it further. Question everything else you've been taught to accept without evidence. Build networks with other people who refuse to stay controlled. And understand that every time you choose to see clearly, to think independently, to spread forbidden knowledge, you're undermining the same system that has kept the Kentucky family imprisoned for over a century and a half. The truth is a weapon. And now you're armed. Use it.